What's going on, guys? This is Social Science Simplified, and welcome back to today's video. And in today's video, we are going to be doing a hypothetical 2024 presidential election matchup between the incumbent president, Democrat Joe Biden, and the current governor of Florida, Republican Ron DeSantis. So let's get right into the video, starting with the safe Democratic states, California and Hawaii out west, along with Oregon and Washington. These states have been trending more towards the Democratic Party, particularly Oregon and Washington. California and Hawaii have been relatively safe since the turn of the century, whereas Oregon and Washington have usually been likely but never competitive necessarily, but more recently have seen larger Democratic victories, especially in presidential elections. And now moving over to the Midwest, the state of Illinois, and then on the East Coast, the District of Columbia's 3 electoral votes, Maryland's electoral votes, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine's 1st Congressional District electoral vote, the state of New York, and lastly, one more safe state for the Democratic Party, that is the state of Colorado. Colorado has been trending in the direction of the Democratic Party over the past few election cycles, and in 2020 it went to President Joe Biden by around 13 points, and in 2022, incumbent Democratic Governor Jared Polis and incumbent Democratic Senator Michael Bennet both won their re-election campaigns by over 15 points, meaning that in a presidential election like 2024, Colorado will definitely be safe Democratic. And now moving on to the safe Republican states. And these are going to be all of the traditional Republican states: Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota, Nebraska's at-large electoral votes, Nebraska's 3rd Congressional District, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. And now moving on to the likely states. These are states that are going to be somewhat competitive, but not necessarily at the top of either party's target list for trying to flip these states. And now moving on to the likely states for the Democratic Party. We have the state of Minnesota. Joe Biden won Minnesota by around 7 points in 2020. And especially with Joe Biden's increased appeal to voters in the Rust Belt and Ron DeSantis's lesser appeal to voters in the Rust Belt, especially compared to Donald Trump, who was the Republican nominee in 2020, I think Joe Biden will have a 5 to 12 percentage point margin of victory here in Minnesota. Somewhere within that range. I'd go somewhere around 7, just like in 2020. Sometimes the margin of victory narrows up a bit when a president is running for a second term, but due to the fact that Biden has a strong appeal to working-class Rust Belt voters and Ron DeSantis does not, I believe Joe Biden will win Minnesota by around 7 points, and anywhere in the range from 5 to 12. And now, moving on to the other likely Democratic states. The state of New Mexico. Joe Biden won by around 10 points in 2020. He'll probably win by around the same margin in 2024. Virginia, another likely Democratic state. Joe Biden won by around 10 points here as well in 2020. And in 2024, I expect him to win by a likely margin. And now moving on to one more likely Democratic state, or rather likely Democratic electoral votes. We have Maine's at-large electoral votes. There are 2 at-large electoral votes for the statewide winner in Maine, and I will put those in the likely column for Joe Biden. And now moving on to the likely Republican states. And these are, well, to start off, Nebraska's 1st Congressional District electoral vote, South Carolina. And now these 2 have been likely margins of victory. And while they are likely margins of victory, as in less than 15 percentage points, I do not necessarily believe that these will be competitive. Much in the same way that New Mexico is less than a 15% margin of victory for the Democratic Party, but is not really that competitive. These electoral votes are largely stagnant, even though they are won by less than 15 percentage points. And now moving on to the three additional likely Republican states. These are the states of Iowa, Texas, and Florida. In 2022, Governor Ron DeSantis won his re-election campaign in the state of Florida by 20 points. However, I do not believe that that margin of victory will translate to a presidential election. I believe that Ron DeSantis will carry Florida by over 5 points, which means a likely margin of victory. But I don't believe that he can win Florida in a presidential election by 15 points. And as far as Texas goes, Donald Trump won the state of Texas by around 6 points in 2020. And I believe Ron DeSantis can keep the margin above 5 points because he is somewhat more electable than Donald Trump, but I do not believe he will be able to expand on that margin very much. And lastly, for the state of Iowa has been relatively competitive in the past few election cycles, but it has been trending more towards the Republican Party, and the Republicans are winning Iowa by larger margins than they were earlier in the 2000s. And then one more likely Republican state, and that is the state of Alaska. Alaska was won by Donald Trump by around 10 points in 2020, and while I believe Alaska could be somewhat competitive, much like South Carolina and Nebraska's 1st congressional district for the Republicans and New Mexico for the Democrats, Alaska has been largely stagnant in its political trends. It's been a likely Republican state for the past few election cycles. And now moving on to the truly competitive states, and these are the lean states, the states that are leaning one way or another, 1 percentage point margin of victory to 4.9 percentage point margin of victory. And to start with the Democratic Party, we have Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. Now, once again, New Hampshire was won by Joe Biden by around 7 points in 2020. But I believe that Ron DeSantis would do better than Donald Trump did in New Hampshire. But I still believe that Joe Biden will carry New Hampshire by around 4 points in 2024. In looking at Michigan and Pennsylvania, I believe Joe Biden will expand on his margins of victory from 2020 in these two states, given that he has strong appeal to working-class Rust Belt voters and the strong Democratic showings in these states in the 2022 midterms. And now moving on to the lean states for the Republican Party. And starting off, we have Maine's 2nd congressional district. While this district has been trending Republican in recent election cycles, it does have a Democratic representative, Jared Golden, who was re-elected by around 7 points in 2022. And I do not believe that Ron DeSantis has the same appeal to the voters in Maine's 2nd congressional district that Donald Trump had. So I believe that this electoral vote will become much more competitive. While I believe it will remain in the Republican column, I believe it will definitely become more competitive. And then moving on, we have North Carolina, which Donald Trump won by a lean margin of victory in 2020. And I believe that Ron DeSantis would carry North Carolina by around the same margin in 2024. And lastly, moving on to Ohio. Ohio is a state that has been trending Republican in recent election cycles and was likely Republican in both 2016 and 2020 and in the 2022 Senate race. However, I believe due to Joe Biden's strong appeal to working-class Rust Belt voters, as well as Ron DeSantis' lack of appeal to that same demographic of voters, especially compared to Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis is not necessarily a populist, and Joe Biden has passed legislation supporting the working class and has a strong appeal to the voters in the Rust Belt. Once again, he flipped 3 states in the Rust Belt and expanded on Hillary Clinton's margin of victory in Minnesota by 6 points. I believe that Joe Biden could make Ohio more competitive, and much like Maine's 2nd congressional district, I believe it will remain in the Republican column. However, I believe it will be much more competitive and a much more interesting state to watch on election night in 2024. And now moving on to the tilt states, and these are the states that are going to be won by either party by under 1 percentage point. And Joe Biden right now is 10 electoral votes away from victory, and Ron DeSantis is 35 votes away, or electoral votes away from victory. And there are 3 states in the tilt Democratic column, and these are the states of Wisconsin. Once again, Wisconsin has become more competitive while it is still Democratic leaning, and re-elected Democratic Governor Tony Evers in 2022. I believe on the presidential level it will have a similar result to what it did in 2020 with Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee and incumbent president, winning Wisconsin by under 1 percentage point, although I believe he will slightly expand on his margin of victory from 2020. And now moving on to Nevada and Arizona. These are tilt Democratic states as well. While I believe that Ron DeSantis has a relatively strong appeal in the Rust Belt, in the Sun Belt, especially compared to Donald Trump, I believe that Joe Biden will carry both Nevada and Arizona, and this is shown by the fact that the Democrats won the Senate races in both Nevada and Arizona in 2022, carrying Nevada by just under a percentage point and Arizona by 5 points, and the Democrats won the governorship of Arizona by just under 1 percentage point in 2022, which is why I'm throwing both of these states in Joe Biden's column for 2024. And lastly, there's one state that will be in the Republican tilt column, and that is the state of Georgia. And the reason I'm putting Georgia in the tilt Republican column is because of its geographical proximity to Florida, the fact that both Florida and Georgia are from the South. Ron DeSantis will have relatively more appeal here than Donald Trump did in 2020. Granted, Donald Trump was a resident of Florida, but he was originally from New York, whereas Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida. And while I believe Democrats have had strong showings in Georgia in recent election cycles, winning 3 Senate races over the course of 2 election cycles, and all 3 of those Senate races went to runoffs, and Democrats have had strong showings here, I believe a slightly more electable candidate than Donald Trump, for example, Ron DeSantis, he is slightly more electable than Donald Trump, would outperform Donald Trump here by enough to flip the state. However, I would not be entirely surprised if the state of Georgia goes to Joe Biden in 2024. Additionally, incumbent Republican Governor Brian Kemp won his re-election campaign by around 8 points in 2022, and he is once again an electable Republican governor, meaning that Ron DeSantis, who is a little bit more to the right than Brian Kemp, would still be able to carry Georgia by under a percentage point. But as the final results of the election are tabulated, Joe Biden would defeat Ron DeSantis 287 electoral votes to 251 electoral votes, meaning Joe Biden would be re-elected as the 46th President of the United States of America. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I hope you all have a great day, and I will see you on the next upload.